Bayside Folsom, good morning. Happy Super Bowl Sunday. Go Dodgers. My name is Brannon Shortt. I get the honor of being the co-lead pastor here at Bayside Folsom with my friend, my beloved partner in crime and ministry, Brian Chad Thunderbreeze Hopkins. If you didn't know that was his name, you've been put on notice. You know now. And I want to start this morning by saying a few things. As I say that like I'm just now saying something. I'm going to be talking for a long time. But I want to start by saying this. One, I love this church. God, I do. Like, I used to work for a guy, and I thought it was so corny. But I used to work for a guy down in Southern California who almost every Sunday he would look at the crowd and he'd say, "Have I told you lately that I love you?" I'm like, "That's so corny." And now I'm like a year into this, and every weekend I just want to be like, "I love you. I love you. I love this place." And some of you are like, "We don't know each other yet." I promise I don't have to know you to love you. I really don't. I think you've seen it as you walk in. I'll say it every weekend. Until I die, you are enough to be loved here. However, wherever you're at in your given story, you are enough for honor and dignity and respect and your story to be held sacred in this place. So I love you and I love this church. You guys have meant so much in my life and it's only continuing to go. But I just want to say it one more time. I love you. I also love me some Brock Purdy. Go Niners. My wife told me this morning, I said, "Who are you pulling for?" And she goes, "Taylor Swift." And I said, "The Chiefs?" And she goes, "No, Taylor Swift." So go Taylor. So not only do I love this church, love me some Brock Purdy, I also love me some California. Now listen, I'm an East Coaster, so sometimes it bothers me when I hear Californians talking about how much they don't like California, because I uprooted my whole life to love California. I love California. Throw up that. Anybody ever seen this? Anybody ever been to Big Sur and seen this bridge? This is like what I think of when I think California, because when I think California, one word comes to my mind, and it's not Niners. The one thing that comes to my mind when I think California is majesty. It is majestic. I could sing about the majesty of California. I could go 525,600 minutes just on California's majesty. But I won't today. But I'll say this. For those of you that don't know, maybe you're newer to the area, California is home to Lake Tahoe, the Napa Valley, Laguna Beach, Joshua Tree, Big Sur, the Redwoods, the Mendocino coastline, La Jolla, and Torrey Pines. But the king of, note, we did it again, back. The king of them all is Yosemite. Yosemite is the king of California. Anybody in here been to Yosemite? Then you will get this. Yosemite is 760,000 acres. There are 25 waterfalls in Yosemite, including, go to this one, Yosemite Falls. Anybody ever been to the valley and seen the upper falls fall into the lower falls? Do you know that this waterfall is 2,400 feet tall? Making it the largest waterfall in height on the North American continent, even taller than Niagara. Go to the next one. Do you know that these sequoias in Yosemite are believed to be 3,000 years old? So while Jesus is laying in a manger, these trees were 1,000 years old. It's amazing. And if you've been there and seen them and tried to wrap your arms around them and hug them and you just can't, and it's amazing. The majesty is everywhere. Do you know that there are 400 species of animals that make Yosemite home? And there are few places in the world, and I've yet to see this, but there are few places in the world when the moonlight hits the water that you might see, this next picture, a moonbow. There are very few places in the world where at night the moon is so bright and it hits the water that you can see a rainbow in the dead of night. Yosemite is Narnia. Yosemite is where all of me comes alive. A few years ago, I was driving into Yosemite, and if you know that drive, you know that drive. It is suddenly like everything changes. Suddenly, as you're going into it, your heartbeat starts to calm. Blood pressure goes down. Suddenly, things you've been battling for years just go away. And all of a sudden, at least in my mindset, it went from city to forest. And I'm driving down that road and it goes from noise to silence. Seriously, when you turn into Yosemite, it does feel like Narnia. I'm half believing that a family of beavers is going to walk out, invite me to dinner, 90s kids, as Petrie, Ducky, and Littlefoot go scampering through the valley. It feels like the Land Before Time. It's just majesty. And all of a sudden, I can remember it like it was yesterday. All of a sudden, I took a left-hand curve and a turn and saw something I didn't expect. I saw the deepest green I had ever seen all of a sudden turn black. Specifically, I saw green go to ashes because just a few months before, this was Yosemite. Yosemite was on fire. And it was, guys, it was so stark. It was like the deepest, deepest green my mind could imagine. To go to the next picture, to a grove of trees just black, just burned to a crisp. And I've only done this a few times in life, but when I saw this, I literally pulled to one of those little inlets off the side of the road, put the car in park, and walked over into the middle of it. I can remember it like it was yesterday. It's like my senses exploded. I literally got down on the ground, and I don't know how to explain this in case you've been around land or space or wood or ground that was burned, but the closer I got to the ground, it still felt like it was getting hotter. It was like you could almost feel heat still radiating from the ground. But there was something crazy. I was in the midst of those ashes, and I saw these little guys. I saw these little seedlings amongst these once beautiful trees that were now barkless. They were seared to a core. These trees had stood the generations. My grandpa's grandpa had seen these trees, and now there they were, black and charred, and some of them lying dead on the ground. But that wasn't it. There was also these little seedlings, these little trees that were beginning to grow again, but out of black ash. There were even flowers that were lavender in color that were growing amidst the ashes. And in that moment, something in me stirred to real emotion. Like a physical display of emotion. Because there I was on my knees in that ash with these little baby trees that will one day will provide shade for families on vacation, for laughter and picnics in the park of Yosemite. But in those ashes where things once stood, there was those trees, these beautiful trees, and they weren't coming back. They were dead. It was charred. And there I was, holding both of these realities at once. I remember my eyes closed and tears were falling. And I'm not sure at that moment why I was driven to such emotion. But I had a mentor once tell me, if you find yourself crying and you're not sure why, God is probably speaking. So I closed my eyes and I could hear the birds singing. And you've heard me describe this before. Bird songs move my soul because no matter how hard I try to sing them, I just can't do it. They sing a song that my tongue and my throat and my vocal cords could never produce. And then I opened my eyes through the tears, and in the distance, I could see parts that weren't burned. I could see what seemed to be beauty off way out in the distance. So there I was in ash with dead things as new things sprouted, with beauty off in the distance and the birds singing. And I thought to myself this line, why does this feel so familiar to me? Why does this feel so familiar? Why does it feel like I am standing in the perfect picture of my story? Why does it feel like in this bed of ashes, I'm standing in what is the perfect picture of some of my own dreams? And Bayside Folsom, it's because I was standing in the perfect illustration for life. Because life is beautiful. And it is so hard. Life is so joyful. You ever heard a baby belly laugh? You ever seen a fluffy cow run around a yard with a mini goat and a mini horse? Just me. Joy? I can't even describe music. And it is so horribly awful that there are moments in life that are Romeo and Juliet romance, and there are moments in life that are absolute tragedies. And there are times where our hearts in those seasons feel soaringly like birds whole, and other times where we feel utterly broken. I often say that my life a lot of times is like this bowl, and you're like, what? White? Nice observation. Yes, but that's not what I'm pointing out. My life is a lot of times like this bowl that's actually more tender than I care to admit, that it's beautiful and useful and fragile. And fragile, that it doesn't take long this side of heaven, if this is my life, it doesn't take living too many years for instead of life to look like this, that it looks like this. Heads up. You ever been here? You ever been here where you were scrambling to pick up this piece and then you picked up this piece, both that were a part of your life, and you have no idea how to put anything back together again? You ever been standing in the midst of this and there's so many fine pieces that it doesn't matter how much super glue you had in the world, it doesn't feel like any of this is actually fixable anymore? Have you ever been so quickly transitioned from that place to this one, where life didn't feel as whole as it once did, where the fragility of things was on display? And I have to say that it's here, amidst this stuff, where the questions start popping up. That it's here where we usually start asking why. It's where questions of, God, are you there? Do you care that I suffer? Do you care that I'm in pain? I don't know how to put these pieces back together, God. And I even question that even if you're with me, are we ever going to be able to put any of this back together, the emblem to like any semblance of what things once were? It's from that place that we ask our third question in this series, and that is this: what do we do with the problem of evil and suffering? The question that the scholars have called theodicy. In the evil and suffering we see in the world and in our own lives. But this question isn't new. The Greek philosopher Epicurus posed the same question many of my friends today are posing. 300 years before Christ, he said it like this: is God willing to prevent evil but unable to do it? Because if so, then he's not omnipotent, meaning he's not all powerful. If he's willing but he just can't do it. But is he able but not willing, then he is malevolent, meaning he's not kind. Or is he both able and willing? And if so, then why is there evil? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why do we call him God? That was his line. And I cannot tell you, in some paraphrase or another, how many times I get this question. And I can't tell you how many times I've asked it. There are two disclosures before we get to our points today that I have to say. The first one, and you can write this down, is everyone must address this question. Everyone must address this question. This is not a Christian question. It's not a Christian question to say, what do we do with suffering? That is a human question. What do we do with suffering is not due to the Bible. What we do with suffering is going to be part of our humanity. And let me give you some options, and just really factually, academically honest. I got some of my friends that are like new age religious. A lot of high school kids like you hear a lot of this language, where evil and suffering is actually, if we break it down, an illusion. Because the goal of this line of thought is reaching a transcendent enlightenment where one abides by the law of attraction as they manifest their destinies. So then if you're just not manifesting all of your dreams, it's probably just because the energy was off. The vibes weren't vibing. The suffering in the world is people just suck at manifesting. That's what it is, because actually I'm the captain of my own ship, and if I just manifest hard enough, which I guess looks something like this. Somebody define to me what that even means? Because the universe is bringing all its particles together, and the universe is looking out for me. Second law of thermodynamics, the universe is dying. If the universe is your God's dying. Mine's already died, but he was only dead 3 days. Hey, okay. It's just the energy's off. The vibe is whack. Or I got some Hindu friends who I love and adore and respect and hold honor for them. But in Hinduism, suffering is the result of karma. That it's cause and effect. That whatever you did in the last life is what you got in this life. Dang it. I guess, man, if me before I was me, when I was me in that life, did all of this stuff, now I'm stuck in this caste system that I can't get out of. Man, hopefully the next me in the next life will be okay, but this is just a result of karma. Chalk it up to that. Or I taught the science message at Bayside Davis last weekend. There were 26 scientists in the crowd. 26. They did a panel after full of scientists from Berkeley and Davis. And then there was me. What a joke. But it was so awesome to dive into it. Listen, if you're going to go scientific naturalism, then suffering, especially when it means others die, is just part of what Darwin actually called the killing of the lesser of us. He literally said there are lessers in our species that are slowing down our movement forward. If you really believe that, if you're really going to take that aim at suffering, then please just stand up and point at the people in here who are the lessers. Is it the people who have a different skin color? Is it the people who can't walk? Is it anybody whose IQ is not 124 and above? We believe that everybody was made in the image of God, all worthy of dignity and honor. But if you're going to hold the other thing, that's not evil and suffering. It's naturalism taking its place and killing off the weaker. Richard Dawkins said it like this: DNA just is, and we dance to its music. If that's what you're going to do with suffering, everyone has to deal with pain and suffering, because this isn't a Christian question, it is a human issue. It is a human question. So point number one is everybody must address it. You can't live your life pretending it don't happen, and it does no good for us in the church to pretend suffering is not real. But the second disclosure is this, and I say this with as much pastoral sensitivity as I can muster. Erasing God out of your life won't erase suffering. You can attempt to erase God, but that won't fix suffering. I've had many of my friends walk away from faith over suffering. Many. And before we give them some like, well, 1 John says if they walked away from their faith, then maybe they were really never, before we miss me with the fecal matter of the answer in your box, can we hold the tension that suffering actually ought to be hard for us to reckon with? Before you give some like arrogant theology answer where you try to put a messy world in a clean box, can we just hold the tension that it's pretty dang hard to wrestle with 71 people getting shot in Vegas at that music festival? It's pretty tough. It's pretty tough when the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, hold the number, kills 230,000 people. 230,000 of them. Or what about the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, or antebellum American slavery? Or what about those of you who have watched a family member get eaten alive by a disease that took their life? It is hard to know all powerful, and yet those are wrestling points in our faith. It's why when writers And I'm not going to mention his name because I made a commitment that I wouldn't a long time ago, but there was a very prominent writer who once wrote, "Love wins. Hell is choosing to live something other than love. Life here and now is just as much hell as you want it to be." And I'm sitting there like, you privileged, insensitive, arrogant, egotistical punk. Tell that to a human trafficking victim. Tell them their life's only as much hell as they're choosing it to be. Tell that to people whose kids have leukemia. Miss me with that stuff. Miss me with these easy little can ball answers that instead of dealing with the mystery and the uncertainty, we attempt to just hold everything certain so that we feel less comfortable in the midst of other people's pain. And here's the thing. If you see all of the brokenness in the world and conclude there is no God, I have terrible news for you. I have horrible news. If you see the brokenness and conclude there's no God, that still won't solve suffering. There will still, even if you don't believe in a God, you can try to erase him from your life, but you will still have a refugee crisis. If you erase God, you will still have a houselessness crisis. If you erase God, people in your life will still die from disease. And you still live in a world of evil and pain and suffering. And all of that in our own lives, let's be honest, is not if we face those things, it's when. So if you erase God or attempt to out of your story, you will see the same suffering. You just won't have any ultimate hope that it'll end. There was a guy, a good friend of mine, still today, who is a genius. Guy went to UC Davis in undergrad, went and served in the military, went and got a master's degree at Dartmouth, Ivy League Dartmouth. Then went and took a job in an agency that's first letter is C, second letter is I, and then agency. Went high level in that, then joined a presidential administration to oversee relations to one country, then went to the private sphere 2 years ago, raised $5 million for a startup out of his own network, and 2 years later, as of today, his valuation of the company is $240 million from 5 in 2 years. The man is a genius. And I'm sitting with him at Jungle Bird on J Street. If you know, you know. It's a great little place, very vibey. A lot of manifesting is happening there. I'm sitting with him there, and he's at a different church at the time, far up 80, and he says to me, he goes, "Yeah, the pastor gave a message today on theodicy, evil and suffering." I said, "How was it?" He looks me in my eyes and goes, "It was bull." I said, "Really? What made it bull?" Excrement. And he said to me, he goes, he just couldn't say the words that would have healed people in the audience. I said, "What are the words that would have healed the people?" He goes, "If he would have just looked at them and said, 'I don't know all the answers,' then we would have all felt like we were in it together." Instead, he quoted 4 or 5 big theories around suffering, tried to put everything in a neat box, and couldn't humble himself enough to just say, when push comes to shove on some of this, I don't know. And he goes, but if he would have said that, it wouldn't have solved the issue. It would have meant we were together. So here's my confession to you this morning. I don't know all the answers. And I won't stand up here and pretend to. I won't make little of suffering. I won't make it trite. I will hold the tension with you. There are some things we can know while we have to admit that we don't know everything. And I don't know all of God's ways that are higher than mine. I don't know where you're at in your own story. But I'm just promising you today, I can never forget what he said. If he would have just leveled with us. So that would have been the pastoral thing. When push comes to shove on some of this, why did God do? I don't know. So I want to start by saying that. And that's biblical. Everyone in this room has had that Peter at the hard teaching moment. The disciples look at Jesus in John in chapter 6, and Jesus gives this teaching, and then they look at him and say, why did you say that? They said, Master, this is a hard teaching. Who could even be able to accept it? So they literally say that it's a hard thing. They ask him why. Jesus looks at them and says, are you going to leave like the others did? Jesus, you lacking compassion? These guys have been following you through the streets and you don't give an answer? He says, are you going to leave? And then Peter says, it's up on the screen. It says, Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom should we go? For you still have the words of eternal life. And I don't think Jesus is lacking compassion. I think he paints this picture for all of time, that there are things that are hard that we will ask why to, that we will not get answers to, and we'll get the choice to stay or go. But that there's a reality where we cannot get answers to something and still stay. That we can still cling in that and say, no, you didn't answer my why question. There's not one account where Jesus answers them. Not one. And Peter says, yeah, and yet still, where else are we going to go? Because your words, you said in your words that this wouldn't always be this way. You have the words of eternal life, even if I don't have the answer to all of my whys. I don't have all the answers today. But the foundation of this house is this. Suffering is real, and we all have to do something with it. Erasing God won't erase suffering, and I don't have all the answers. So if that's the foundation of the house we're building, now let's build 4 floors. Point number 1 today is this. We have a phantom pain of the soul. Let me ask you a few questions. Why do you long for justice? Because you have never seen a world where justice has reigned. It's an asinine thing to long for justice when you've never seen it. That justice would rule the earth. That we would go after justice and justice and justice. A lot of literature on justice. But if we're being real, going after justice when we ain't never seen justice rule the world is kind of crazy. Why would we do that? Why do you long that there no longer be poverty when all you've seen is poverty in every place that you've ever gone? Why would you long for it? Is there something there that's actually testament to something else? Why do we all long for suffering to cease when in the human experience, suffering is what we have all known? That's why I call it what I call it. I call it a phantom longing. It's kind of Phantom of the Opera-esque, where the phantom is up in the rafters and everybody knows it's there even though they can't pin him down. There's this longing in us that I would be danged if you could tell me that you could deny it. That you long for things you've never seen. You long for things you've never experienced, but in small quantities, outside of small quantities. And if you were just a puddle of atoms clashing together in the universe, who cares? Who cares? Who cares if people die? Who cares about misuses of justice? If there is no God, I mean this with all sincerity, there is no such thing as evil and suffering. Because if there's not an absolute moral lawgiver, then it's going to be hard to claim there's any absolute moral law. But you look at the world and see design and purpose. But if there's no God, there's no evil or suffering. And you say, what do you mean? We believe in like objective reality by moral relativism based on culture. I get that argument, but when people tell me that, I kind of throw up in my mouth and swallow it. You know that experience? Yeah, it's gross. That's how I feel when people are like, no, truth is just defined by culture. So then what I tend to do is I rear back and I just punch that person in the throat. Right in the apple. And then when they say, why did you do that? I would say, in my culture, that's how you say I love you. And don't tell me it's not true. Well, Brannon, that's ridiculous. Was it ridiculous when the Mayans burned 10,000 kids? And who are you to say? Who are you to call that wrong? It was worship in their culture. What about when Jesus says the gates of hell wouldn't overcome it, and he's actually at the gate of Pan, at the temple of Pan in Caesarea Philippi, where it's called the Blood River, where they would actually slit the throat of babies, throw them in the river until the river turned red. He said, no, not even that would be able to stand against what I'm doing. But it's hard to call that wrong if there's no objective. And if it's all dependent on culture, you know it. The phantom longing in the rafters of your soul is that you long for something more and nothing else does. Lions kill gazelles and eat them, and nobody puts them in prison. Nobody. We put Jeffrey Dahmer in jail for eating people, right? But we don't do it with lions. We don't do it with lions. We know there's a difference. Dogs don't do it. My dog Gizmo is perfect love on 4 paws. He's a 13-pound schnoodle. He's beautiful. My wife will be like, Brannon, why are you not greeting me each day like you greet him when you get home? And I said, Casey, if you greeted me the same way he does, if you ran to the front door naked and started spinning around in circles, don't step to me, homie. Harvester ants live 30 years. What I was saying about my dog is he's perfect love, and guess what? He doesn't give a rat's butt if we ever drill another clean water well for anybody. He doesn't care. But you do. We'll sit here in this church and raise money for kids to have hospitals. No, nothing else does. Ants live 30 years and they dig holes, and that's it. C.S. Lewis said it like this: if we find ourselves with the desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we are made for another world. The psalmist said in 119 in verse 20, he said, my soul is consumed with longing. Acknowledge it. There's a phantom longing of the soul. So when I hear my friends wrestling with suffering and pain, I get it. I don't shame them. I understand it. Because God didn't mean for there to be suffering. God's design was the garden where you walked with him in the coolness of the day, living in harmony with all of the animals, eating of all fruits and vegetables from the entire garden except for one. But where the beauty of the coolness of the day and walking with the Father was the reality of the person. And we chose outside of that space. So when my friends wrestle with it, wrestle with longing they don't even understand they have because they want a world that they've never even seen, especially when they're right here. Especially when life doesn't make sense, especially when they can't put stuff back together. I can hear my own friends who hate God or don't believe in God longing for this verse to be true. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people. And he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God, and he will wipe every tear away from their eyes. And there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old things have actually died and passed away. And then he who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new again. My belief and bias is that all people have a phantom longing that is called Jesus' kingdom, where we beg God for his kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. And often, and I want to be so sensitive, Bayside Folsom, to this, often, Father, let me say this right. Often our pain and anguish and suffering, though it was not God's design, God is no doer of wrong, highlights the evidence that we need and want God, if we're being honest. I'm not glad of your suffering, and I'm not glad of mine. But even our suffering can point us to the phantom longing that we want something. We know it shouldn't be this way, but if we feel it ought not be this way, then there's a way we feel deep down that it ought to be. Point number 2 this morning is this: we must remember that Jesus suffered. I'm sorry, there's not been a writer in history that said, follow Jesus, the smiling Savior. Did Jesus smile? Of course he did. I would have loved to walk town to town with Jesus, jabbed him in the side and see if he hated that stuff. I'd love to, one day we'll get to. But I'd love to know if he hated the feeling as he wore sandals of sand in your shoes. You know what I'm talking about? And all the giggle fest they would have had. All the jokes, people tripping and falling. Like, I would have loved to have seen all of that, and one day we'll get to. But history says Jesus is the suffering servant, not the smiley giggle. I'll be honest. I will see gold statues of certain gods in certain types of restaurants. And there's a large bald guy smiling at me. And I see the smile, and something actually hurts me. Because everything here is not grinning. Everything in here is not smiling. John Lennox said it like this. He's a mathematician at Oxford. He said this amazing line: "You must acknowledge that the world is beauty and bombs. It is beauty and barbed wire. And any explanation that's not real enough to face it doesn't work, because any explanation that doesn't face suffering is not real. It may prove wise to at least listen to Christianity before you reject it." For the centerpiece, friends, of Christian faith is a cross. And we forget that, especially those of you that are Christians. Christians, you're the first usually, I'm the first usually, to forget the cross is at the center of the story. Or at least to go glazed eyes when we hear the gospel, which is heartbreaking. There's a death machine in the middle of Jesus' story. And the claim of Christianity, if you've never heard it or if you've heard it 1,000 times, is that the man on the cross is God. So if you're just being academically and ethically honest, if God is on a cross, then the next question ought to be, why is God on a cross? That doesn't make any sense. Why is all-powerful, can do anything, can smite whoever, can live whoever? Like, why is God on a cross? That's not the message of any other religion. There's only one God that takes on skin like that, and it's Jesus. He takes on our skin, and he doesn't remain distant from human suffering, but actually, friends, becomes part of human suffering, joins us in it, takes on ours. And that the resurrection's claim is that death isn't the end, suffering's not the end, pain is not the end of the story. That Jesus came to pay for our sin and our brokenness, our pain and our suffering, so that he can end evil and suffering without ending us. Those of us who tend to be the ones who cause it. And can I just tell you this? And we're iffy around this in church, myself included. The final judgment's really good news. Because those of you hidden in Christ, get recipients of Christ's righteousness, you walk into that place and go, I trusted Jesus, the great deliverer, and the Father sees Jesus, and that's what it is. But the final judgment as it pertains to suffering is beautifully good news, because in Christian doctrine, that means the Holocaust doesn't get passed over. That means murder doesn't go unaccounted for. That means abuse doesn't just happen behind closed doors and nobody ever knows about it. That means one day that justice will actually reign, which is what all of us want, even though we've never seen it. And it's not just because God's God and all-powerful, but because God took on pain and suffering so that one day he could end pain and suffering. Tim Keller said it like this: the message of the cross doesn't answer all the questions of why. It doesn't. Why God allowed, again, we don't have all those answers. It doesn't answer all the questions of why. We don't know what it means all the way through, but we know what the cross doesn't mean. What it cannot mean, if God takes on skin and suffers in our place, it cannot mean that God doesn't love us and that he doesn't care about our pain. We don't know what all it means when you're here. But if the message is true, if it is, then it can't mean that he doesn't love us. And it can't mean that he doesn't care. This is how we know God showed his love among us. That he sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. For this is love, not that we loved God first, but that he loved us and sent his Son as the atoning sacrifice for our sin. 1 John 4. So if he cares about our joy and our strengths as well as our pain and our suffering, then number 3 is true. Prayer is the safest place to process pain. Prayer is the safest place to process pain. Can I give you my entire theology of prayer in one sentence? Prayer is not a place to be good. It's a place to be honest. My prayer life became real when I stopped playing games. Because I don't know about you, prayer was boring for most of my Christian life. Wasn't sure, just thought it was the right thing to do. Until I started praying like the Bible actually shows us how to pray. So I started praying with all that was actually in me, bearing me before God. I believe this with my whole heart, Bayside Folsom. Nothing is off limits in prayer. Nothing. There are prayers in the Bible that would shock you. We'll get to some of them in a minute. But when you're in that bowl place where things feel broken and how do you put the pieces back together? Can I be sensitive? It's hard to pray there. It is really hard to pray when you are in pain over what feels like unanswered prayer. It can be hard. David has this beautiful line in the Psalms, and he says, "Can you hear my sighing, Lord?" It seems like he's depicting God when all I've got in the midst of my sorrow is, are you big enough that you can hear the things I can't say? When I can't bring things to words, can you still hold me in this place with the resounding answer in the text being yes? But let me give you a few examples of praying and suffering. Psalm 6, verse 3. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long? Or Psalm 10:1, where he says, why, Lord, do you stand off at a distance? Why do you hide yourself in the times that I'm in trouble? Why, when it feels like I'm going through the most, do you feel hidden? Or Job says, God, I'd put you on trial to even see if you were good. David prays at one point, have you forgotten the covenant because it seems like you have? That's heresy. And he prays it. And it makes the text. Nothing is off limits in prayer. I'll spare you some of the non-trauma informed ones where David's praying for people to get killed and the certain way they should kill people's children. Why don't you just kill my enemies? Have you forgotten the covenant? Prayer was a place, if we believed prayer was a place we could actually be honest with the things we feel are too much for others but aren't too much for God, our prayer life changes. Because when it becomes real, it's when it becomes honest. I told some of you this story. There was a friend of mine dying of cancer. And there was a group of adults there, and I say this with all due respect because I was one of these adults, praying like adults pray. And here's what I mean in that particular set of adults. They were using prayer to hide. They were praying and I was praying. The things we felt we were supposed to say, but then the deeper things we were really struggling with, we felt like we couldn't say it out loud. So it sounded a little something like, God, preeminent one, full of love and mercy, if it be your will. But as long as we say if it be your will, then we don't have to really risk too much. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pray that way. The Bible talks about that. I'm saying often that's heart posture. If we're holding a healthy heart posture, that's great. But if we're holding that in a means to hide from what we actually want to say, it's not. God can handle your real. So we're going around and praying, honestly, these surface level prayers that sound good. And there's one kid in the circle and he's 10 years old. And it gets to him and we're popcorn prayer and he's holding hands and he prays these words, God, don't let him die. And I broke in tears because I was like, God, that's what I wanted to say. And some piece of me was scared too. Can I actually be that honest with you? Can I actually say that? 2 women in my life got diagnosed with cancer this year. And that 10-year-old changed my life. Because I sat out in my car when I found out a family member of mine had got diagnosed with cancer in July. I sat out in my car in our driveway weeping, hoping that my tears and my sighs God could hear. And by the time like 35 minutes later I could produce any words, the only thing I could say was, God, don't let her die. Can I be that exposed before you? And if I'm that exposed, is that actually good news? That you can meet me where I actually am? If God actually cares, as we just concluded or asserted that he does, can you write down the word care in your notes down a line, acronym style, because pastors use acronyms even if they shouldn't, and even when they shouldn't, just because. But I think this one really works. Care, C-A-R-E. And besides C, I want you to write complain. Or if you're not good with that word, even though biblically I think that's actually more accurate, put call out. Call out. Describe the problem to God as honestly as you can say it. As honestly as you can say it. Appeal. Appeal. Ask for God's intervention by appealing to who he is. R, remind God of his promises. And this is beautiful because Moses does it, Abraham does it, and the psalmist does it. And we were like, whoa, remind God of his promises. You know, the secret sauce of that is not that God has forgotten, it's that you usually have. It's a beautiful piece of that. And E is express trust in him in the meantime. And you're like, Brannon, what is this? Complain, appeal, remind, express. Walter Brueggemann said, this is the biblical pattern of how to lament. We don't talk about lament a lot in church, but I would be remiss if we walked out of here today without a roadmap of how to. So I want to show you in Psalm 22 how lamenting, which is a word that means expression of grief and sorrow and mourning and wailing amidst suffering, tragedy, or injustice. There's a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations. And we ignore it a lot in church. I'm being honest, myself included. But this is so unlocking for us. Look at Psalm 21, how he follows care perfectly. Psalm 21, my God, why have you forsaken me? You thought Jesus was the first one to pray that? Jesus is praying the Psalms. Why have you forsaken me? And why are you so far from saving me and so far from my cries of anguish? That's a claim. That's a call out. There's a complaint in that. The very next verse, however, says, yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you, our ancestors, listen to these three repeats, put their trust, and they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. The appeal to God's character here is that he's trustworthy. How about the next, in verse 11 and 19 of the same psalm? He says, do not be far from me, but you, Lord, do not be far from me. There's this heart of reminding, God, you said you'd be with me. You said you would. You promised you would. And in that, I hope that the reminder to him as he was writing is that God is. And then he ends the psalm by saying, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord, and they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn that he has done it. The psalmist starts with, why have you forsaken me? And ends by saying, I don't know how all this ends. I just know the generations to come will know that the Lord is good and that he's done it. There's a C-A-R-E, cry out, appeal to character, remind God of his promises, in so doing reminding you, and then expressing trust. There is nothing out of bounds in prayer, and everything ought to properly be taken to this conversation with the very heart of God. Point number 4, and I want to invite the band back up for this. You're like, Brannon, you started preaching, we wasn't even in the room yet. We know we can get here 15 minutes late because you don't start until later. No shame. Just saying, we did that on purpose so we could worship at the end. But point number 4 is this, write this down, the conclusion of it all is take heart. John 16:33 says, I have told you this, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have, listen to this, many sorrows and trials. And does he say here on earth you might have them? Here on earth you will have them. Many sorrows and many trials, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. I love that phrase, take heart, because in the Greek it means to be courageous and brave. That when we're in this place, it's pretty hard to be brave anymore, or to be courageous, or confident. All of that feels hard. And Jesus is saying, no, you will face many trials. There's no ignoring suffering. But take heart. You can still be courageous and brave because I've overcome the world. Paul says this crazy line to the Romans, and he says, but we glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope, this is the way he ends it, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out onto our hearts through the Spirit. I'm really slow to say this morning, Bayside Folsom, because it hurts to say it. vulnerable moment. It hurts to say it. But I believe it. That with Jesus, according to those verses, somehow, in a way that I don't know, suffering ends in hope too. That God is actually faithful somehow to use and redeem it for good. That there are things that were done for evil that God meant it for good. And that God is somehow working all things together. That somehow, like those 3 Hebrew boys in that furnace, it says that God would be in that furnace with us. The Bible says that He's our living hope. And it's clearly seen because God Himself would suffer for you. I don't know if you've heard it this way before, and I want to propose it to you today. Isaiah 53 says, He shall see the suffering of His soul and be satisfied. And talking about Jesus, He shall see His own suffering for the glory that was before Him, Paul said. He would see His own suffering, and yet even Jesus would be satisfied after. But why? My righteous servant shall justify many, and He will bear their iniquities. What satisfies Jesus in His suffering is you. Is you. Is the forgiveness and the adoption and the loving of you. Tim Keller said it like this, that in Him seeing you as His hope in His suffering, that's what will allow you to see Him as yours. That you are that loved. Go back to Yosemite. I was there just recently, and this is that same valley by the same photographer. There's still the markings of the charred past, but trees are growing. And it's not just little bitty trees. They're actually already producing shade, and little foxes are running around them. That it won't always, I promise life won't always look like this, because every season's different. But I can't tell you it might look more like this. This bowl is handcrafted in the Japanese art of what's called kintsugi. And kintsugi holds 2 principles, where the broken bowl would be put back together with lacquered gold, holding 2 things to be true. Number 1 is this, that there's an embracing of imperfection. That in our life, breaking is simply going to be a part of it. But actually that the breaking would make us stronger. And that the lacquered gold is meant to literally illuminate the breaking points. Because the ancient Japanese scholars said it like this, that breaks were like wrinkles in skin. They were merely signs of wisdom. So I want to ask us to do something vulnerable today. Our prayer team is going to be back in this corner. And in these 2 songs we're doing of worship, if you need individual prayer, you're in a moment in time, you need just somebody with you to pray, they're going to be back here and we want you to pray with them. But I'm going to ask something too. There's 3 different people in this room. I am not exposing anybody. If you don't want to stand up, you don't want to talk to anybody, don't. But for those of you that want the prayers of the church in this moment, would some of you be willing to stand up where you're at right now and say, I'm actually suffering in this season of my life. There's actually a pain or a struggle or a suffering moment in this season of my life. If that's you today, some of you, would you be bold enough to stand up right now? Yeah. And here's what I want us to do. If there's somebody standing, actually stay standing, yep. If you are suffering, or like I see a hand up, if you're around them in these next 2 songs, would you not touch them, you creeps? In case you have their permission. But would you just reach a hand out towards them? Do you know that there's people sitting beside you every week going through hell and high water and trying to swim? Would you pray for them, church? And then for those of you in the room that are like, I don't want to see somebody face to face. I can't do that right now, and I don't want to stand in front of 650 people. That's okay too. For those of you in this room, know that they're here too. So would you be praying for them as we go through these songs? The best person I've ever seen pray for somebody in pain is Corey Lewis, pastor here at Bayside Folsom. And he said, you know what, I think we should do something like this corporately to end this service in these last 2 songs. And we're going to. But I want to read you one thing from Narnia, because I'm me, as we go into this, to hopefully engage this moment of prayer in this posture. Diggory is a guy and the magician's nephew, and his mom is dying of a disease. And Diggory looks at Aslan, the Jesus figure, and says, but please, won't you? Can't you give me something that will cure my mother? Up till then, he had been looking at the lion's feet on the ground and his huge claws. But now in his despair, he looked up at the lion's face. And what he saw surprised him as much as anything ever did in his whole life. For the tawny face that was bent down near his own, the wonders of the world, had great shining tears in the lion's eyes. They were so big and so bright compared with Diggory's that for a moment he knew that the lion must care more about his mom than he did. And then it says that Aslan leaned in and gave him a lion's kiss that filled him with courage. Maybe some of you have been scared to pray in this season of your life. I would just challenge that maybe Jesus cares more about it even than you do. And we can hold you in the midst of it. So those of you, again, would you stand back up that want corporate prayer? And then those of you, would you reach your hands out towards them and pray for them today as we sing these two songs? And as we do, would you rise and sing them with us?